Welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about configuration files in ASP.NET Core. The specific items we're going to touch on is adding the application settings to the appsettings.json file, adding database settings section to the same settings file, creating a new project to share the common classes that we're going to need to load those settings from the configuration file, as well as configuring the ASP.NET Core application to load those settings. We're going to then move on to adjusting the entity framework to use the database settings from the settings file. We're going to validate the end-to-end database connectivity once the settings files have been used to actually establish that connection. And then the last step, we're going to modify the ASP.NET Core application to display a value from the configuration file, specifically the application title. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and open up the Visual Studio. And I'm going to use the project that we created before for the contacts application. If you haven't seen the videos where we started actually creating this application, you can go ahead and go back to the playlist before and take a look at the video to show you how to get started. In this project, in this solution, we have two specific projects. One is the main ASP.NET Core application. The other one is a context database project that contains actual database connectivity information, as well as the classes that are used to load information from the database. And what we're going to do first is we're going to get started by first adjusting the application settings file. So in this file, as you can see, it comes in by default with logging section. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new section here specifically called app settings. And you simply do this by creating a new JSON structure that reflects the settings that you want to have in your application. So I'm just going to call this app settings. And then this is a key value pair. However, how you kind of have to look at it is if you actually have a section called app settings, if you do the curly braces, that indicates you have a hierarchy structure set up for it. And then you can start specifying the kind of settings you want to have in here. So in this case, what I want to be able to change through configuration is the application title. So all I have to do in here is I'll just create in quotes, double quotes, the actual name of the configuration setting that I want to be able to pull. And I'm going to call it application title with a colon, and then I'm going to specify the value I want to be able to actually display. So in this case, I'm just going to call it contacts application. And then another thing that I want to do is within the app settings, I'm going to define a new section that's actually going to reflect my database configuration. So, and you do that by simply doing the same thing I did for the app settings, and I'll just call this database. And then again, since this is going to be a separate section that's going to have its own set of properties, I'm going to put the curly braces in here as well. That indicates that it's going to be another section nested within the app settings. And then here I can start creating different properties that I want to be able to configure for the database itself. So in this case, I'm going to specify the server that I'm going to be connecting to. In this case, I'll just give it a value of local. Which will indicate that it's actually connecting to a local server. It's hosted on the same computer that the application is running on. Then I'm going to specify the database, and in this case it's going to be called contacts. And then another thing I'm going to specify is the usage of integrated authentication. Now, if you want to be able to use a username and password, you can also specify that. And then within your application, you can actually put in logic to say, you know, if you're using integrated authentication, you can use that, or if you have username and password specified, you can actually pass in the username and password. So in this case, I'm going to create a property called integrated auth. And because this is a Boolean, I'm just going to actually specify the value of true instead of putting it in double quotes and then having to parse it. So now that our application settings are done, including the database settings, what I'm going to start doing is creating a separate project that's actually going to be used to store common information, specifically the classes that I'm going to need to use between my main application and the database project as well. So, and I'm going to call this contacts.contracts, and this project is going to be mainly used to hold interfaces, classes, objects that are going to be needed and shared between the different projects in this application. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the class. It's basically a sample class file that gets generated. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the default namespace, because I don't want to have to use contacts.contracts.something else, since it, for me, doesn't really make sense for that application. So this is going to be the default namespace that gets generated anytime you actually create a new class or a new interface within this project. And what I want to be able to do is say contracts.configuration or contracts.interfaces all within this project structure. And this way I don't have to constantly delete the contracts from the actual name of the DLL or the class. So here I'm going to also create a folder called configuration. This folder is actually going to contain the app settings and database settings classes that are going to represent the values stored in the actual app settings.json file. So I'm going to call this configuration. And then what you'll notice is when I create a new class here, which I'm going to start off creating the app settings class first, you'll notice that this app settings class is actually going to live within the namespace of contracts.configuration because of the changes we made to the default namespace. So I'm going to make this a public class. And then I'm also going to actually go ahead and create another class called database settings, because I'm going to need to be able to reference it in my app settings. And I'm going to also make it a public class. So let's go back to the app settings, and then here what I want to do is I want to actually specify the properties that are going to be loaded from the app settings JSON file. And if you remember, I had the application title and the database. So the way you do this is by creating a new property, and in this case the application title is a string. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it application title, and the naming is important. It uses the naming to match the actual property names in the app settings file. So this is going to automatically know that it needs to pull the value and populate it in this property. And the other property I'm going to create is going to be the database property, and because it's a database settings, I'm going to give it a type of database settings, and this is the class we created a moment ago, and then I'm going to call it database as the actual name of the property. And the system is going to automatically know that this is a section, and it needs to actually try to deserialize and put all the values from the subsection of the database and populate all the values inside of that class. So, and we'll see that in a moment. So now let's go back to the database settings file, and then here I'm going to create the properties that are going to match the database settings properties that are defined in the configuration. So, and we had a few of them defined, and here you can see we have the server, database, and integrated auth. So I'm going to go ahead and create those here. So the property that is string for server, a property for the actual database, and then another property that is a Boolean, and it's going to be called integrated auth. Okay, so now that our classes have been defined, what we're going to do is we're going to need to actually go ahead and tell ASP.NET Core application to load the specific settings. So we could do that inside of the startup CS file inside of the contacts main application. And if you remember, when we were creating this project, we've actually hard-coded the database connection information in here. So we can go ahead and actually delete this information now, and I'll show you how to adjust the settings now to be able to initiate the connection from the application settings file. The first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to delete this information or setup information to initialize the DB contacts. So the application is still going to know how to create the context object itself, and we're going to relocate the initialization and pulling out of the configuration values inside of the context object itself, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But before we do that, the first thing we need to do is we need to actually tell the application when it loads that it now needs to actually load and know about the app settings, and you do this by calling services.configure, and in a generic argument, you're going to pass in app settings. Now notice that I don't actually have the type defined, or this particular project doesn't actually know about it, so it is defined in another project. And what you can do is you can hover over this, you'll see this helpful icon here, and you'll notice that it says add reference to the contacts.contracts project. So you can go ahead and click this add reference, and it's going to automatically discover this app settings class inside of the project that we created a moment ago. So now what I need to do is I need to actually tell ASP.NET Core what section to actually load and populate inside of this app settings object type itself. And you do that by calling configuration.getSection, and we're going to give it the name of the section. So, and the section is called app settings. And this is enough to actually tell the dependency injection framework inside of ASP.NET Core that once it loads the app settings, it needs to actually populate it here and make it available inside of the dependency injection framework. And you'll see how this is actually going to be then consumed. So now the configuration of ASP.NET Core is done here, and what we can do now is we can adjust the entity framework to start using the database configuration. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the context object, and in here we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to actually set it up so that it obtains the access to the app settings, and you do this by using the dependency injection framework from ASP.NET Core. And since the object itself, the actual context object, is being loaded by ASP.NET Core itself, it knows about the context, and it can resolve all the dependencies that this object is looking for through the constructor. So, and what you would need to do is you need to actually specify an interface that ASP.NET Core knows about, which is an iOptions interface. And this interface will allow us to actually get a reference to the app settings that is managed by dependency injection, and we'll just call the argument name settings. And again, what we're going to need to do is we actually need to import the Microsoft Extensions option namespace that allows us to use the iOptions object. And then also we need to add a reference to the app settings, just like we did for the main contacts application itself. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And now these objects actually are aware and know what to do. So I have an extra parenthesis here. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually populate a private property to hold the settings object itself so that I can use it within this class once it initializes. And I will do that by creating a new internal property or private property, which is called settings. And it doesn't actually exist yet. We'll go ahead and create it, and I'll show you how. And then I'm going to populate it with settings.value. .value is just an actual object or a property that iOptions exposes to get access to the actual class that it represents. So in this case, Visual Studio is telling us that the property doesn't exist. So what you could do here is you can go ahead and click this icon again, generate a variable setting, and then we're going to go ahead and generate the actual property. So you can see it creates it down here. And we'll go ahead and make sure it's private. By removing public, it actually makes it private. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this private accessor. So here now we've actually created a private property that holds reference to the app settings class that was initialized and provided to this instance of this context object itself. And now we can start using it. Now, in order to be able to tell this context which server and which database to actually connect to, we need to actually intercept the configuration process to say when you're trying to get started, when somebody tries to actually instantiate a new instance of this class to connect to a database, we need to actually tell it how to connect to the database. And we do this by overriding a configuration method, and it's called onConfiguring. and it will allow us to actually overwrite and intercept that behavior of the setup process. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually need to build a connection string and then tell the options builder object itself to use that connection string to initialize this context itself. So, and you do this by creating a new class. There's many ways to do this, but this, for me is the simplest. There's actually a .NET Core class called SQL Connection String Builder that you just initialize a couple of properties and you reference the connection string property itself, which generates the full connection string that is needed for connectivity to the database. So I'll call this con builder, and we'll go ahead and initialize it, SQL Connection String Builder. And we're gonna open close parenthesis on this. And again, since I don't have a namespace here, I'm going to go ahead and use the helpful IntelliSense and add the reference to the namespace. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use what's called an object initializer. And here I'll press Control Space to give me IntelliSense completion and change to the Properties tab here. And what you'll notice is here's all the different properties that are available for the SQL Connection String Builder instance class. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set the data source, which is basically the server that we're going to want to connect to. And the value we're going to set on it is going to be from the settings class that the app settings class that we initialize here and being referenced to the settings property. We're going to go to the database. And then here we're going to reference the server. Then we're going to need to set the initial catalog, which is the database we're going to connect to. And again, we'll go to settings, database, and database as the actual property name. And the last property is integrated security, which is integrated authentication property in our app settings JSON file. So settings, database, integrated auth. And now we actually have our connection string builder populated in order to generate the full connection string required. And in order to actually tell Entity Framework to start using that connection string, we're going to have to say options builder, use SQL server, and we're going to pass in the con builder connection string itself. And now, since it's populated with a connection string, and it's going to call the rest of the base initialization logic, is going to pass in that new state of the options builder down to the base class, and it will now know how to connect to the database. So we can validate this by starting to execute the application. And I'm going to put a breakpoint right here to show you the actual values being pulled from the app settings file itself. So I go ahead and click IS Express, and it's going to compile and start the application. And what you'll see here, it's went into the debugger, and now what we should be able to see is looking at this connection string, you can see that the actual value of that is now set to data source equals local, initial catalog set to context, and integrated security equals to true. So basically it worked exactly how we needed it to work. So if I go ahead and hit continue here, it's going to load the page and it's going to show us the values that is coming directly from the database. And you can see here Joe Smith and the birth date showed up. Now that's it for connecting to the database using the configuration. One last thing that I wanted to show you is how do we actually use the app settings inside of a view to be able to maybe change the name of the actual application. So let's say tomorrow we decide to call it Wonderful Contacts or My Special Contacts, whatever the name of the application you wanted to give it, without having to change any of the code. So let me show you how to do that inside of the actual application itself, and specifically the views. So in order to do that, what we're going to want to do is we want to go to the views, and in this case I want to change it across the board for every single page. So we could do that by adjusting the layout file itself, which is used by all the different views. And in here you can see that the title that gets generated for the HTML structure is actually set here. So the view data, this actually will set the title of each individual view itself, whereas the context, which is the actual name of the application, is hard-coded in here. So what we want to do is we want to adjust this, and in order to do this, what we want to do first is we actually want to inject the app settings object itself, just like we did for the context itself. And we want to do that for the view here, so we have a reference to it. First, we'll get started with importing using the using statement. We want to import a namespace that references the iOptions object, just like we did in another class. And we do that by doing the @using at the top of the file here, and we're going to reference Microsoft.extensions.options. So that's the first thing. The next thing where we're going to want to do is we actually want to tell the view to inject a specific type of a class, and you do that through doing the @inject statement. And now we're going to reference the iOptions interface, just like we did in the class before, and we're going to want to reference the actual app settings class. Now, because I didn't actually do the using statement for the app settings, the thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to give it a fully qualified namespace, which actually is better in this case because it doesn't pollute a bunch of different namespaces or this view with a different set of namespaces that I might not want to use in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference directly the namespace itself, so configuration and then app settings. So in this case I gave it the type that I want to inject, and then the way that I'm going to reference it is through the app settings name of an object. So I'll show you what this means. So now we can actually use the app settings to replace this hard-coded context value. So, and the way you do that is you put the @ symbol and then you reference the app settings dot value dot application title, and this will actually replace the value that's coming from the configuration file and put it right here, and we'll make it available to every single view that gets rendered in this application. And then I'm also going to go ahead and find it in the footer here, and I'm going to replace that value here as well. So if you remember, in our app settings file we actually called it context application, and then before it was just called contacts. So now if I go ahead and actually run this, you'll see is that the value has changed, and now it's actually pulling the value directly from the settings file. So, and you can see in two places. Here you can see it in the actual title of the tab, as well as in the footer. It actually gets rendered here. I could have also changed it here. You know, it all depends on the requirements you have for your application. So this is all I wanted to show you today. If if you have any questions, go ahead and leave the comments below. And if you want to see other videos related to the configuration, how you use these settings, please go ahead and leave me a comment as well. And I'll try to come up with a way to answer any of your questions and show you how to do different things that you can with your application settings. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to talking to you again.